researcher in the National Science Council. His research is based on the combination of history and archaeology to study European medieval societies in three main areas: the study of territories, society and power in medieval Europe, the analysis of medieval written sources from the point of view of historical memory, political discourse and document forgery, and the application of information technologies to research in medieval history and archaeology. So you can start where you want.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Juan Antonio Quiroz for this opportunity to be participating in this fantastic event, not only because of the scientific commitments that it implies, but also because of it being dedicated to celebrate the figure and the achievements of Chris Wickham. I think it is a fantastic occasion to be present here. Now, also I have to thank Juan Antonio for having passed me the hot potato of starting with this title, and I just hope my presentation will be good enough for sort of opening, although I'm afraid it will be a bit of a sort of personal brainstorming, in that I will be presenting a series of ideas and suggestions more than any articulate research program or global perspective, which I don't think can really be done easily at this time. Well, this is a conference on social inequality, and my presentation has to address the specific point of the state. And it's like a bit like, as we say in Spain, to start by building your house by the roof. Because in many senses, the state is the final stage of social inequality. So I will be dealing in this presentation with an important conundrum of social studies in general, which is how social inequality in general turns into the specific structural organization of the state. And this, of course, is a very, very big topic, which has been addressed in many different ways by a number of scholars from very different perspectives within the social sciences and history. There is a big body of literature about the origins of the state that departs from what we could call a classical linear evolutionary model, both in anthropology and in archaeology, that traces a sequence of developments that leads into statehood from different stages of societal structuring. And I think these well-known models have been very, very strongly influential in all realms of social sciences, and they still are in many respects. And they have a lot to say, so they are important to take into account. However, it's not that easy to apply those models to early medieval archaeology. I remember years ago in a project that we were working together, Andrew Reynolds pointed out to me that when trying to make sense of evolutionary theory for the early Middle Ages, you could spend your whole life running in circles and never getting anywhere. And it is important to say that, however, elements of evolutionary theory come up every time, constantly, when dealing with the early Middle Ages. Evolutionary models were originally developed thinking specifically on the primary states of the Near East and Mesoamerica. And it is important to bear in mind two major issues about that development. And first, that they were talking about primary states, that is, stateless societies that turned into state societies by different ways, but different arrangements, and due to different causes. But the thing is that we're talking about primary states. On the other hand, the kind of evidence that was used and the kind of models or study cases, more specifically, that were selected determined a trend to address specifically very large-scale societies. What we, from a medieval perspective, we would call empires. And in that respect, very high degrees of social complexity were the norm. And we're talking about specific arrangements that probably are difficult to match with the early medieval situations. So this is a very important strand of development, but one that is not that easy to combine with early medieval Europe. Moreover, in recent times, there has been the reverse trend to make more complex approaches to the same issue of the origins of the state by mixing the issues of state formation, that is the process by which societies turn into statehood, with non-linear approaches. And I think the non-linear approach is a very important addition to the model, in that it gets rid of the evolutionary sequence that seems to lead teleologically from nothing into statehood, and by some sort of mental leap into our world, the world of states. And it contemplates the possibility of disruptions, of breaks in the process, even reversion of the process. So studies about collapse have become very, very fashionable these days. It's not that long ago that we had a conference in Salamanca about collapse of kingdoms in the early Middle Ages, so it's some sort of feeding back constantly. And the notion of collapse is, of course, is strongly connected to the situation in the early medieval period, because the demise of Rome is one of the big issues for all early medievalists. Now, I'll contend that the real origin of the interest about collapse has more to do with the fall of the Soviet Union and the way it was brought into the agenda of historians and social scientists generally. And more recently about environmental collapse and more fashionable ideas, which are theoretically, I think, weaker. But in any sense, collapse has become an important thing. And one immediate consequence of studying collapse is the interest about regeneration. Because in cases studied all over the world, it is frequent to find that collapse is not just leading into nothingness, but it leads into different versions of recovery and regeneration, and sometimes the reconstruction again of state systems. So both ideas, I think, are valuable, and when applied to the classical evolutionary model, they make it more flexible and more applicable to situations that we are interested in. However, there seem to be two different conceptions of the state that are not necessarily incompatible with each other, but one tends to prevail instead of the other in certain situations. On the one hand, scholars tend to focus on the most visible organizational aspects of state, and that means the institutionalization of governance. That is the creation of formal structures by which individuals occupying certain specific positions contribute to the formal workings of the state. And normally the emphasis is set on military, on the defense, and on justice, the prevention of conflict. And in some respects, but not always, in the organization of work, of production, to a degree of complexity that cannot be achieved by individuals without state agency. This kind of institutionalization of social governance and social relationships is, I would say, present in every vision of a state. However, it is not that frequently that we find the second issue, which I think is absolutely crucial, which is the issue of domination by social elites. In the words of Charles Tilly, states are systems of durable inequality, systems by which social difference is turned into a transgenerational arrangement that outlives individuals and turns into something stable. And these formalized structures of, for the transgenerational reproduction of inequality are, in my view, crucial to the understanding of state and state formation, but they are very frequently concealed in scholars' views, especially when most of the emphasis is put on the issues of governance, in the sense of arranging for giving voice to the representational aspects of social life, and domination is put into sort of underground or background situation. Of course, among early medievalists, there have been lots of discussion about the state and about state formation. And I would say that in general, institutional or organizational approaches tend to predominate. Here we find the issue that the starting point for all notions of statehood in the early medieval period derives from Rome. And this sort of colors all approaches, either because a strong dependence from the Roman inheritance is postulated, or otherwise because no dependence is postulated in other cases. At this point, I think Chris Wickham's contribution comes really interesting in that he distinguished different kinds of states in the late antique and early medieval period, thinking in terms of the resources that the states were able to put into working, and the capabilities that were facilitated by means of those resources. And he talked about three types of states. Strong states of the kind of Rome and Byzantium that are basically based upon taxation systems and develop a machinery of bureaucracy and military that are in correspondence with the strength of taxation. On the second hand, weak kingdoms, which would basically comprise all of the barbarian kingdoms, in which there were systems of governance, there were structures, there were bureaucracy, but taxation was fading out, and especially the military was no longer based on payments by the state, but more on land assignments given to them. And finally, the non-states of Northern Europe, and that's an issue for content, of course. And I think this division marks very neatly the differences between states of development of statehood, more than just different pedigrees of the state. However, thinking in historiographical points of view, there are basically two major narratives that dominate the early medieval landscape regarding state. The first of them has to do with Francia, and it has to do with a long-established scholarly tradition that purports that the late antique state never faded out, really, in the Frankish core, and that the continuation of late antique civilization into the Middle Ages made it possible to sustain a sort of epi-antique society into the year 1000, when the so-called feudal revolution or feudal mutation would have given way to a feudal dismantling of state structures. I think this vision of the state is very, very powerful, has been very influential until recently, and in many respects it colors the way we think about nearly every medieval society, either because they are included within the Carolingian realm, and so they are part of the process, or because they connect to it by emulation, imitation, or whatsoever. So in some situations, it is gauged how state-like is any given society by comparison to the Carolingian developments. And on the other hand, we have Northern Europe, sorry, where the main issue is state formation. So we have societies which are either beyond the Roman borders, have never been a part of the Roman Empire, or where the Roman state had faded out completely, And then we have a situation that comes closer to the idea of primary states. We're talking about stateless societies that walk into statehood in different phases. And this is where evolutionary models have been most influential. So if we think about Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon or Irish societies, it is easier to find explanations based on evolutionary models than it is in the Carolingian core of Central Western Europe. Now, this movement from deep fragmentation towards increasing complexity is very often combined with an emphasis on the active role of local communities because of the fragmentation of political structures and the representative character of rulership in those societies. So a strong accent is made on assemblies, representational devices of all sorts that make rulers more sort of spokespersons than lords of their societies. And the real big issue about how state develops from that situation is the creation of social distance. That is how the political structures manage to separate themselves from too much dependence on local communities and begin to operate regardless of those local arrangements. And we have all sorts of models developed for these areas, although again, this is a situation that is easier to spot on literature on Northern Europe. Specifically, it may be interesting to retain some of the issues about state formation in Northern Europe, because different models have been proposed to explain how this works in a sort of primary or ideal situation in which very small communities of the size of, say, the Irish Tuath, which are really very small, relate to the ruler by a very organic relationship that is based upon closeness to the society. And this kind of fragmented landscape builds up by the establishing of higher rulers on the basic territorial rulers. In the notional Irish system, there are 3 such layers. It's not necessary to have the 3 of them. But the point is that the relationship between society, the territory society, and the ruler is set upon the lowest levels of these arrangements. So in a more developed model, we would have several territorial communities, each with a ruler. Then the rulers would get into clientship networks and kin networks that would develop patronage pyramids. And eventually, a great ruler would be imposed upon all of them. The crucial issue here is that the greatest stability of all is on the local level. That's where the relationships are steady and they seem to prevail. Whereas anything above that is very volatile, in the sense that it's subject to the alternatives of warfare, of kinship, marriage, political developments of all sorts. And these kind of relationships can be short-lived, depending on personal relationships, and they can explode very easily within a person's lifetime. So this is a landscape in which people can perceive actually that the upper layers are very, very unstable, whereas the lower levels are not. So the whole issue about the development of statehood has to do with the separation of the political life. I don't know if is the cursor showing? The separation of the political society from the local communities, a process in which the relationship between ruler and territorial community is disrupted, and local communities no longer have a say in upper political arrangements, and they remain assemblies for local discussions, but not for the workings of the political as such. In this respect, there are many different ways in which this can be developed, and we can think about situations like Scandinavia, where the local things get less and less involved in upper politics, and they turn into more rural and local arrangements. or situations like Anglo-Saxon England, where the lower layers were basically erased and replaced by a different state-driven, bottom-up driven organization. Well, I think one important aspect of this model, the Northern model, is that it combines two different and sometimes contradictory issues. On the one hand, an idea of political rule or rulership that has to do more with governance than with imposition, with representation more than exploitation. But on the other hand, the model of the ruler is that of the warlord. And the kind of relationships that get established among the aristocracies are those of the military elites, highly militarized elites. So there is a very strong contrast between the situations regarding the governance of local communities and the relationships between aristocrats or among the aristocracies. Well, in the second part of this paper, I would like to apply a bit of this to the Northwest Iberian case. And I would like to start by saying that none of those models can be applied straightforwardly to Northwest Iberia. And both of them can be applied to a certain extent and with qualifications. So I will be making use of both of them. But I would like to say that probably the most important issue to bear in mind is that of secondary state formation. And that's where any understanding of early medieval situations has to depart from the classical evolutionary theory. This is, what I'm going to say now is really a collective contribution, because it comes from a book that is in the final stages of preparation and in which Ori Stenson and Stuart Brooks and me have collaborated in the introduction. And we have discussed this issue of secondary state formation. Our position is that there are no primeval states in early medieval Europe. There's nothing like a primary development of state formation. There is always a secondary development from something else, and states are there at the point of departure always. And there are basically four ways in which secondary state formation influences the development of states in early medieval Europe. The first of all is, of course, direct inheritance, to be a development from an earlier arrangement of state, like it is the case of post-Roman kingdoms, would be the case of Chris Wickham's weak states of the division I commented above. Now, the second is the introduction or the reintroduction of features of complex governance from outside. And this is a feature that is very prominent in the historiography of the North regarding Christianization. Because Christianization is not just a matter of ideology, it's also a matter of the introduction of, first, notions of property and non-holding, and second, the introduction of a powerful, well-developed formal organization that is not to be paralleled with anything in society at the point of introduction. A third obvious situation is that of the incorporation by another polity, that is societies which are not developing a state as such, but they get absorbed into a state, and then they have to adapt to these new situations. And then a fourth, maybe more subtle one, is those territories in which their political dynamics are linked in some way to external powers, that is states, that don't really operate upon them directly, but they are in the periphery, they are satellites, they are parts of political units, but very disconnected from the center. To put one example, this could be the case of Catalonia within the Carolingian realm. Catalonia hardly ever gets any direct influence from the kings. However, they work within a system in which the belonging to the kingdom is a very important aspect of political developments. And the same can be said for the county of Castile. They very rarely have contact with the king of Leon, but connections with this notion of king kingdom and kingship are very important in the political developments inside the county of Castile. And all of those affect the northwest of Iberia in the early Middle Ages. Okay, so this is going to be a very quick review of ways in which we can see developments toward the state in northwest Iberia. Just to give a very quick review for those who are less familiarized with it, most of Iberia and a bit of southern France were part of the Visigothic kingdom after the 6th century. And this collapsed in 711 with the Arab invasion that started control of a part of Iberia by the Caliphate. In this situation, the northwest of Spain turned from being a part of the Visigothic kingdom to being virtually uncontrolled by anybody, by any serious polity, after 711, basically after 750 more like. And there was a gradual development of political control started in Asturias, in the north, and working in sort of stripes until the 10th century, and then later on into the 11th century. So what we're seeing in the map is the situation by the end of the 8th century, with the Asturian kingdom controlling most of the northern fringe, then the expansion into the Duero Plateau in the 9th and early 11th century, and then later on. I have marked Castile, the original core of Castile, and Álava, because they will be taking part in my explanation a bit further up. Okay, well, as it comes to direct inheritance, the regions we're talking about, they were all part of the Roman Empire. They have been subjected to a system of strong statehood that leaves its print in the localities as much as in wider arrangements. However, it must be borne in mind that this is a peripheral region of the Roman world, and even in the 5th and 6th centuries, it was a peripheral region of post-Roman Iberia. This region where the fragmentation of the Roman system was intense. The decline of towns was very, very serious. There was a widespread abandonment of villas, especially the highest and the most luxurious villas were abruptly abandoned, more than slowly transformed. And there was an emergence of new settlements in hill forts in a situation that looks very fragmented, very inarticulate. However, this has been sometimes taken as a proof of the complete demise of Roman inheritance and statehood in the region. And I have admitted those points years ago. I'm not that sure now. I think that there are issues that would have us think that certain layers of statehood can be detected in the area within the Visigothic period and beyond. And I would even contend that some of the developments following some of the recent work done by Wendy Davis on the continuation of documentary culture and legal culture, notions of justice in the region, suggest that some of the elements of statehood that we would, in theory, would associate with imposition from the state and something that needs to be fueled and maintained by the state were actually embedded in local societies to the point that they were reproducing this kind of state-like culture without direct intervention of the state. This has to do with the arrangement of justice at the local level, the continuation of notions of law and rightfulness and authority, and it has to do probably also with some layers of literacy and documentary production. So I would say that some of those residual elements of statehood prepare those societies for the construction of or the regeneration of state if the situation is appropriate. Then to go to the issue of incorporation by another polity, this is exactly what happens in the region, especially in the south. There is the development of a polity in the north that is not really an inheritor of the Roman or Visigothic past, but it presents itself as such. And then it incorporates in different moves all of the north and most of the plateau. However, this is a well-known feature of Iberian history and has entertained scholars forever. But it very rarely is admitted that beyond top-down imposition, there is lots of space in this development for a two-way agency, for bottom-up proactive participation by the localities. So if one think of the resources that the kings of the 9th and 10th century could deploy to control this huge area south of Asturian realm, it is very difficult to think that they could actually impose anything on such a big territory without the participation of local elites and communities. Then, regarding the introduction or reintroduction of features of complex governance from outside, it's not so much an issue of Christianization, because all of these areas were Christian from the moment we were talking about, as much as the introduction of influence from better developed areas. And I think in this case, it's necessary to consider the important role played by clerics emigrated from Al-Andalus in the mid to late 9th century, that went to the north, connected with the kings, and basically became the aides, the political aides of the kings of Asturias, and provided them with a huge new weaponry, an ideological and legal weaponry derived from the Visigoth of the kingdom itself. It is the clerics from the south that invent the notion of neo-Gothicism, the revival of Gothic rule enacted by the kings of Asturias. They bring law, they bring ecclesiastical organization, they bring notions of ideology and royal authority, and those notions connect with the ones that were already present in the north, that were less defined, and they turned them into a political program that is really powerful ideologically. So this kind of development is an example of the introduction of state resources from an external area into another. And I probably must say that the role of Southern clerics and Southern Christians has long been undervaluated in explanations of the situations in this region. So, thinking about territories where the political dynamics were connected to external powers, we have examples like Old Castile and Álava. These are seen normally as districts of the Asturian kingdom, and they are actually satellites in the fringes, in the eastern fringes of the kingdom. However, what is interesting about Álava and Old Castile is that for being districts, and very often legal historians tend to look at them as simply administrative bounded territories, they undergo their own territorial expansions just as if they were independent polities. So Castile turns from this little core to this in the late 9th century to this in the early 10th century. And it's very unusual, really, in early medieval Europe to see subaltern districts grow like that. They normally, there is juxtaposition of districts or new territories, but it's rare to see one of these districts growing so much. In this respect, I would contend that the Castilian elites found in the connection to the Asturian kingdom the proper fuel for leading their own expansion and finding the scale that suited their interests within the overall political system. So, I'm approaching the end. I would like to say a couple of things about the actors. And on the first hand, the elites. The first thing about the elites is that an elite is a relational concept. You cannot define elites in an absolute way, because they are defined regarding the rest of the population that they are elites of. So there is a wide diversity of elites depending on the scale, depending on the relationship to the rest of the people. We have to contemplate the possibility that urban arrangements survived in the plateau just as they did in the Ebro Valley. And when I say urban, I mainly refer to towns in the sense of collective collective groups that have control of the hinterland, of a rural environment from a central point. You don't need to have a proper development of urban functions in the sense of markets or craft production. But the point is that this is a collective dominion of a countryside. Then you have rural communities that we know are internally unequal. Then we have super-local elites of different kinds, and of course the kingdom's aristocracy. And all of those elites may have interests of different kind in the construction of statehood, at different scales and with different intensities. Regarding the local rural elites, if we think about the Duero Plateau with all those very, very small-scale communities, internally differentiated, to be incorporated into the Asturian kingdom means a big change of social landscape. It creates a huge social distance between the core, the political core, and the localities. And then there are three possibilities. Local elites may react to this situation by maybe escaping the community, trying to join the lower ranks of the aristocracy, maybe creating strategies of distinction within their community, trying to adopt forms of aristocratic way of life. Things like holding weaponry, like having a horse, like maybe having a chapel, or building a tower, things that mark them out from their communities. Or failing that, they may remain as local leaders, maybe seigneurial agents, seigneurial go-between, and then they may even adopt situations of resistance, of which there are documentary evidences for some interesting cases. What is interesting is that moving up into the ranks of aristocracy, this is again context and scale dependent. This is Pablo Escobar, a well-known drug dealer that was killed a few years back. And we may think that the kind of power that was strongly personal and strongly short-lived that Pablo Escobar and others alike built in their lifetime within states is to be detected in 9th and 10th century states in Iberia, especially in Al-Andalus, where we can see that there is a phenomenon of warlords or rural lords coming up all through the 9th century and creating lots of trouble for the state. And it is coexisting in the interstices of proper urban arrangements. So the state, the Andalusian state, has connections from the central power to the cities, from the cities to the territories. But in the interstices, there is warlordism developing that sometimes can be very, very disrupting. However, within the Andalusian state, a warlord is a problem. It's someone who has to be dealt with, and it is not really easy to bring in. However, there are other situations in which a warlord is the normal, is the norm. And there is no state or urban situation to gauge them against. And this is what happens in Castile or in Álava, that this kind of arrangements by aristocrats create their own networks without the balance or the counterbalance of state structures. However, if we're going to go anywhere beyond the limits of personal arrangements and aristocratic relationships, it is necessary to construct scale in order to construct social distance. The issue of scale is basically about how to control a territory from a distance. And it has to do with the creation of a state that embodies governance, military, judicial, and the preservation of the socio-economic interests of the elites. Just to put one example, the aristocrats of Castile and Leon in the 10th century have their own states. They are land-based aristocracies, but their properties are extremely, extremely fragmented. They only have very, very small holdings here and there, which means that they have to have a very large territory of operation in order to be enough powerful to be differentiated. So we have, by the time this ends, and we could argue when is that time. We may say this is the late 9th century in the north and the mid 10th century in the plateau. We have an aristocratic class with landed economic foundations. We have the beginnings, at least, of a dependent feudal peasantry, but not every peasant is in this situation. And then we have the creation of a ladder of middle social positions. So we are talking about the creation of an operational scale in which a certain range of physical and technological conditions, of economic activities, and of community resistance to surplus extraction match the creation of this kind of elite domination. Well, I'm going to just skip this because of lack of time. Okay, so a final 2 words about archaeology, and it's really a pity that I only come down to archaeology at the very end of the paper. But regarding the visibility of statehood in northwest Iberia, there are obvious indicators, and maybe the best one and the most commented upon is the investment in monumentality. And we have a central-driven monumentality that is really created from royal circles in the north, in Asturias, and then in the plateau. We can see that this kind of development of architecture, of prestigious architecture, top-notch architecture, is both limited in time and in territory. So you don't have these kind of things all over. They belong to the central royal core. And that there are non-royal foundations that play similar roles in the regions, like in Galicia, that can be seen better as replications or imitations of royal ways of behavior. And this kind of monumentality is not really enough for archaeologists to detect the workings of the state. More recently, there have been developments into the detection of elite sites, and I would say that Juan Antonio Quirós is doing a fantastic work recently on the detection of palatia and elite sites, as well as in Asturias. There have been, this is the royal site of Galzón. And these elite sites are both difficult to distinguish, to recognize on the ground, and again, they need to be taken into a comprehension of the whole territory. Because for what we know of aristocratic economic foundations, we may have elite sites that don't live really upon the surrounding territory, but they work on much larger relationships which are not territorially continuous. And that's a very big issue to take into account. Other obvious markers are the existence of specialized craftsmen, bureaucrats, soldiers, clerics, that is personnel that are working full-time for the elite. And again, there are ways in which this can be recognized directly or indirectly. But I would say if we need to understand how statehood works in the area, we need to look at more systemic strategies. And we need to investigate, and this is going to be difficult because of the lack of a properly dense archaeological record. We need to think basically about economic growth as a marker of state development. We need to think about surplus storage, of which interesting developments have been already published in recent times by this research group. We need to think about craft specialization, especially if this is connected to central places. Think about the articulation of exchange circuits based upon towns. And I would say there are documentary indicators that seem to suggest that we may have a first phase of urban development, of urban growth, round about the 930s to 960s in the plateau, which is not yet archaeologically defined, but it could be in the near future. We need to think about agrarian technology changes and landscape change in general as an indicator of the establishment of a strong state-based elite. And inequality at village level, which is a very tricky issue, that can be worked from cemeteries and churches and from the creation of the parish system. And we may need to think if a community is more unequal, when we can detect differences of wealth in a cemetery or differences in the food consumption patterns through stable isotopes. Or maybe we find communities that are absolutely flat in social terms, that have no differentiation whatsoever, that have no material marker of status, that's when probably we're thinking about real unequal societies, in that the unequal elements have moved elsewhere and they are not present in the community as such. So the community has been really set apart from the workings of society. And finally, a word about assembly sites. Assembly sites is an issue of the North that is very prominent in the literature. And we do have this sort of thing in the South. We have in most of Spain, assembly sites in rural situations have been working like that even until very recently. But if I can make a point driven away from texts, the Visigothic legal codes, which cover lots and lots of possibilities of social workings, they hardly ever talk about any rural assembly arrangements. There are only 3 mentions that I know, and they are very vague, talking about how the local peasants get together and do their business and take care of the things. This is not an indication that assemblies did not exist. This is an indication of social distance, that the state didn't bother about those assemblies, and they were not a part of political life organization in any way. So this only means that in a proper scale, these kind of arrangements mean nothing to political decision taking, whereas in more fragmented scale situations, they can be the core of decision taking. And that's as much as I think I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. Juan Antonio, should we make questions on the speech of Julio, or we continue?
No. Ah, sí. Bueno, bueno, para ser una patata caliente, pues está estupendo. Vamos, me ha parecido un panorama genial. Solo tengo algunas, como siempre, algún detalle que preguntarte o que comentar. Por un lado, en todo el planteamiento que haces a la hora de entender la formación o el desarrollo de estructuras estatales, partan de donde partan, lo que parece que falta, o a lo que parece que no prestas demasiada atención, es a los mecanismos de acceso y distribución de recursos. Es decir, digamos que el esquema se funda en la cuestión de relaciones entre grupos dirigentes de un territorio u otro, pero a mí me da la impresión de que hay algo que solo has dejado casi al final, en lo que rápidamente has dicho sobre la arqueología, pero no a la hora de comprender la formación, el acceso a recursos, sea el acceso a la tierra o a otro tipo de bienes y su distribución. Por un lado eso. Por otro lado, a la hora de hablar de Estado y estructuras estatales, da la sensación de que entiendes que cualquier construcción política es una estructura estatal. No sé si es esa la idea o cuál sería la definición. Pero en principio parece que cualquier estructura de gobierno de tipo supralocal, en fin, la entiendes o la agrupas dentro de esa categoría. Y lo último solo es un detalle. Imagino que eres consciente que me llama un poco la atención en términos de historiografía de los últimos años. Había una diapositiva que has puesto que tenía los 4 jinetes del Apocalipsis de un beato. Era el modelo tradicional de García de Cortázar que de alguna manera has integrado en tu... No sé, eso me parece bien, pero llama la atención.
Juan Antonio, ¿contestamos en español, en inglés o...? but I will answer in English for the benefit of our foreign colleagues here. Well, I know this has been quite schematic, and I couldn't really go into deep details for most of the things. But I think that I did make an emphasis on the issue that if we think about the state only in terms of organizations and structures, systems of governance, systems of administration, we're missing the point. The basic point about the state, in my view, is that it needs to support a system of inequality, a durable system of inequality. Saying in another perspective, it has to be a tool for the elites or the aristocracies in this case to retain their position, and this has to be transgenerational. If it only works within one generation or two, we're not talking about the state. We need to talk about a system in which the people who work for the system, they really, because of the kind of job they're doing, they are different from just any kind of elite. They are working organizationally, and that's, I think, is an important point. So the whole issue about the access to resources and the distribution of resources is essential. And to my mind, it is more important, really, than anything dealing with conflict resolution or defense. This is really more important in defining a state. The problem is it is very different from one case to another, so it's difficult to speak in general terms. But I would say that one of the cores of statehood is a notion of property, a notion of land ownership that fuels this kind of unequal relationship more than any other. And then, depending on how developed state structures are, you can think about how far the role of the state is to just protect the relationship that landowners have with the peasantry, or they raise enough resources to redistribute among the elites. And this is a big difference, has been addressed very thoroughly by John Haldon in The State and the Tributary Mode of Production. And this only, I think, separates different degrees of state development, but the core is the other. And of course, you can have policies in which you don't have this kind of development, so you don't have a state. Right? And as for government structures, yes, this is essential. The thing is, we don't have very good evidence, very good archaeological evidence for addressing the development of governments and government structures. Andrew has made very interesting points about execution cemeteries as a good indicator of this kind of development. But unfortunately, we don't have this kind of evidence, or we have not been able to find it in most of early medieval Europe. And regarding assembly sites as the other indicator, my content is that assembly sites not always connect directly to state arrangements. So, did I answer everything? Well, yeah. How could I put it? I'm not taking issue in this view with García Cortázar, but I think that the landscape, historiographically and archaeologically, has changed so much in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, that it's very difficult to say we're really applying a model by him or by anybody else into this situation. I think what is interesting is that now we are in a position in which we need to combine, and we can combine, models of state resilience, models of state collapse and regeneration. We can bring models in from Northern Europe regarding warlordship and clanship networks, and still we can make them fit with historiographical developments which are a bit more traditional. Although I would say, in my personal view, there is a line that really is a red line that really cannot be crossed, which is the understanding of Neo-Visigothicism and the Neo-Visigothic character of the Asturian state as something that is there from the origins, or something which has been developed very recently before we see it in the texts. And I think that's a point where very few agreements could be reached.
Any other question? Dries. The last
Yes,
one.
thank you. Working? Yeah. Thank you for a very inspiring lecture. There was some point that I picked up something I want to ask you. Is it? I got the impression that you say that the peasant only, as a peasant, is created by the state formation in the 19th century. That before that, it's another world. So that the peasant as a dependent person.
That was very quick. It was in the end. I didn't explain it properly. I was thinking in terms of class relationships. So you have a feudal-like aristocracy, which is based upon bonded peasants working for them in their properties. Then you have a class of peasants. That's it. It doesn't follow that every agricultural producer is this kind of bonded peasants. And actually, you only need a minority of society to be bonded peasants for an elementary aristocracy to rise. Although probably they're also collecting surplus in other ways, by jurisdiction and other measurements from the rest of peasants. Now, you could even argue, following Eric Wolf's points of view, that you cannot really talk about peasants or a peasantry if you don't have a subaltern class of peasants. So a society that is rural and is agricultural is not necessarily a peasant society, and in this case we are contrasting with Chris's views about peasant societies. But in this case, I think the distinction is interesting, because it means that you cannot have the development of an aristocratic class if you don't have the development of a peasant class on the other side.
I agree with you. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much, Julio.